If you enjoy stories that feel real, touch your heart and leave you thinking long after they end, then you're in the right place. Welcome to Mr. Wisdom Stories. Charles Whitmore stood beneath the bright ballroom lights, with one hand wrapped confidently around a champagne glass, and the other resting on another woman's waist. The entire room froze. Soft jazz still played somewhere near the back of the ballroom, but nobody was listening anymore. Hundreds of wealthy guests sat motionless beneath towering crystal chandeliers inside Miami's Hard Rock Stadium Gala Hall, staring toward the stage like they couldn't fully process what they were seeing. And at table 7, Viola Whitmore stopped breathing for a second. Her fingers tightened slowly around the stem of her wineglass while camera flashes flickered across the room. Some guests looked uncomfortable immediately. Others leaned forward with quiet curiosity, because everybody knew Charles Whitmore, successful businessman, millionaire donor, public golden couple. And the blonde woman standing beside him definitely was not his wife. Charles smiled into the microphone smoothly, like this entire moment had been rehearsed in front of a mirror beforehand. Life's too short to stay in relationships that no longer make you happy. A few nervous laughs scattered weakly through the ballroom. Then Charles pulled Isabella slightly closer against his side. That's when the silence changed. Not confused silence, dangerous silence, the kind that settles over a room right before something irreversible happens. Near Viola, her cousin Denise whispered under her breath, "Oh no. No, he didn't." But he did. And somehow, Charles looked proud of himself. Welcome to Mr. Wisdom Stories. Here, we tell stories that touch the heart, challenge perspectives, and remind us how powerful life lessons can be. If you're new here, subscribe and become part of this journey. Around the ballroom, whispers started spreading table by table. Wait, who is that woman? Isn't Viola here tonight? Is he seriously doing this publicly? Several people lowered their phones at first, out of respect, then slowly raised them right back up, because public humiliation had become entertainment now. Viola sat perfectly still while the room began swallowing her alive, one stare at a time. 28 years old, elegant, graceful, beautiful dark skin glowing softly beneath the ballroom lights. The kind of woman people described as strong because they never noticed how much pain she carried quietly. And at that exact moment, she realized this wasn't impulsive. This was planned, carefully, deliberately. Charles wasn't nervous, wasn't ashamed, wasn't emotional. He looked excited, like a man finally performing the scene he'd been waiting to act out for months. Denise leaned closer quickly. "Viola, let's leave. Right now." But Viola never moved. On stage, Isabella crossed one long leg over the other and smiled tightly beside Charles, though nervousness had started creeping into her face now that the entire ballroom understood what was happening. Charles adjusted his suit jacket confidently before speaking again. There comes a moment in life when honesty matters more than appearances. Viola finally looked up directly at him, and Charles smiled, not warmly, cruelly, like he wanted her humiliation witnessed. That smile did something unexpected inside her. The pain stopped shaking and became calm, slowly. Viola placed her wineglass down beside her untouched dinner plate. One by one, nearby conversations died completely. Her chair slid back across the ballroom floor. Then she stood. The sound of her heels clicking against the marble floor echoed softly through the silent room, while every pair of eyes followed her toward the stage. Charles smirked slightly. He thought he knew exactly what came next. Tears, begging, anger, embarrassment. But halfway to the stage, Viola's expression never changed once. And suddenly, Isabella looked nervous. Viola climbed the stage steps carefully, while Charles extended the microphone toward her with fake patience. "You want to say something?" he asked smoothly. She took the microphone from his hand, then said absolutely nothing. 1 second, 2, 3. The silence became unbearable. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Even the waiters stopped moving between tables. Charles's confidence started fading little by little beneath the weight of the quiet, because silence frightened people more than screaming sometimes. Viola finally lifted her eyes toward him. "You could have divorced me privately." Her voice was soft, controlled, but somehow that made the words hit harder. Charles swallowed once. Viola stared directly into his eyes. "You could have left, respectfully." Nobody moved. But instead, a long pause. You needed an audience. The ballroom felt frozen solid. For the first time all night, Charles looked uncomfortable. Viola slowly turned toward Isabella. "And you?" Isabella straightened defensively beside him. Viola's voice never rose. "You sat in my kitchen eating my food while sleeping with my husband." Gasps spread instantly across the ballroom. A woman near the front covered her mouth. Someone whispered, "Oh my God." Several phones lifted higher immediately. Charles stepped forward quickly. "Okay, enough." "No," Viola interrupted calmly. That calmness scared him now, because it no longer sounded emotional. It sounded finished. "For once," she said quietly, gripping the microphone tighter, "we're absolutely doing this." 3 hours earlier, Miami Gardens glowed under the warm evening sky, while luxury cars rolled steadily toward Hard Rock Stadium like a parade built for rich people desperate to impress each other. Black SUVs, foreign sports cars, drivers opening doors beneath bright camera flashes. Outside the entrance, photographers called out names while wealthy donors smiled with polished confidence that looked practiced more than genuine. Everything about the night screamed success. Inside the ballroom, gold light shimmered softly across crystal chandeliers hanging above hundreds of guests dressed in designer gowns and tailored tuxedos. Waiters moved carefully between tables balancing champagne trays, while a jazz band played near the far wall beneath soft blue lighting. At the center of the ballroom stood a massive digital screen displaying elegant silver lettering, the Charles Whitmore Foundation Annual Charity Gala, and directly underneath, a smiling photo of Charles and Viola Whitmore. Perfect, beautiful, powerful. At least, that's what the picture sold to the world. Viola sat quietly at table 7 near the center of the ballroom, lightly tracing her fingertip around the rim of her wineglass while conversations buzzed around her. Her emerald green gown rested smoothly against her skin, elegant without trying too hard. Natural curls pinned neatly behind one ear revealed diamond earrings Charles bought her 2 anniversaries ago. Back when anniversaries still mattered. "Girl, people keep staring at you." Denise leaned closer beside her with a grin. "You look too good tonight. Half these women probably mad already." Viola smiled softly. "Please." "I'm serious," Denise whispered dramatically. "If I looked like this, I'd never know peace." That earned a small laugh from Viola. A real one. Tiny, brief, but real. Denise noticed immediately. Good. Because lately, moments like that had become rare. Across the ballroom, Charles stood near a group of investors beside the stage, one hand resting casually in his pocket while he spoke with smooth confidence. Tall, sharp jawline, expensive black tuxedo perfectly fitted against broad shoulders. People naturally gravitated toward him, especially in rooms like this. Charles knew how to command attention without appearing obvious about it. He laughed at the right moments, maintained eye contact perfectly, touched people lightly on the shoulder during conversations to create false warmth. Every movement looked calculated. Viola watched him from across the room, then watched him ignore her completely. Again, her smile faded slightly. Months ago, Charles would have crossed the ballroom twice already just to kiss her forehead or whisper some private joke in her ear. Tonight, he hadn't looked at her once since they arrived. Denise followed her gaze carefully. He's been acting weird all night. Viola immediately picked up her wineglass. He's networking. That sound alone told Viola Denise didn't believe her. Honestly, neither did she. Near the stage, Charles suddenly laughed loudly at something one of the investors said. The sound carried across the ballroom easily, too loudly, like he needed the room hearing him enjoy himself. Viola lowered her eyes toward her plate, briefly. That used to be one of the things she loved about him. His confidence. Now it exhausted her. Because confidence and attention addiction looked dangerously similar once you lived with someone long enough. A waiter approached their table carrying fresh champagne. "Another glass, Mrs. Whitmore?" Viola almost corrected him. Almost said, just Viola. Lately, Mrs. Whitmore felt more like a performance than an identity. Before she could answer, movement near the ballroom entrance caught her attention. Isabella, 27 years old, tall, blonde hair falling smoothly over one shoulder. Silver dress fitted carefully enough to attract attention without pretending otherwise, and she knew exactly what effect she had on men. Denise noticed Viola staring. "That's the assistant from Charles's office, right?" Viola nodded once. Isabella smiled brightly while greeting guests near the entrance before making her way deeper into the ballroom. Several men turned their heads watching her pass. She noticed every single one and enjoyed it. When Isabella finally approached Charles near the stage, something uncomfortable tightened slowly inside Viola's chest. Charles's face changed immediately. Subtle, but noticeable. People in love recognized attention shifts instinctively. He straightened slightly, smiled differently, leaned closer when Isabella spoke. Too close. Viola's stomach sank quietly. Denise noticed too. Oh, just one word, but enough. Isabella touched Charles lightly near his chest while handing him a champagne glass. He said something near her ear that made her laugh instantly. Not polite laughter, intimate laughter, the kind shared between two people already familiar with each other, outside professional boundaries. Viola looked away first, because suddenly she couldn't breathe correctly anymore. Not from heartbreak, from humiliation, and the worst part, deep down. This didn't feel surprising anymore. It felt confirming. Across the ballroom, Charles finally glanced toward her. Their eyes locked briefly, and instead of warmth, instead of guilt, he gave her a distant smile that felt cold enough to freeze the entire room around her. Then he looked away again, like she no longer mattered. Viola swallowed slowly while tightening her grip beneath the tablecloth where nobody could see her hands shaking. Something was wrong tonight. Not ordinary wrong, not marriage tension wrong, something heavier, something deliberate. And for reasons she couldn't fully explain yet, the beautiful ballroom suddenly stopped feeling safe. Viola kept her expression calm long after Charles looked away from her across the ballroom. That was a skill she had perfected during the last year of her marriage, looking unaffected, smiling when necessary, nodding during conversations, pretending not to notice distance growing between two people sitting inches apart. Sometimes, survival looked a lot like performance. The jazz band near the back wall transitioned into a slower song while waiters carried fresh plates toward nearby tables. Around the ballroom, wealthy guests laughed loudly over stories that probably sounded less interesting outside expensive rooms like this. Denise leaned back in her chair, carefully watching Viola. "You want me to say it," she muttered quietly. Viola kept her eyes on her wine glass. "No, because I'm going to say it anyway." That almost made Viola smile again. Almost. Denise lowered her voice. "That woman over there is way too comfortable around your husband." Viola inhaled slowly through her nose. She already knew. That was the painful part. Nothing about tonight felt shocking anymore, only public. Across the ballroom, Isabella now stood beside Charles speaking with two older investors while lightly touching his arm every few seconds. Charles looked relaxed around her in a way Viola hadn't seen in months. Not stressed, not distracted, not emotionally absent. Present, fully present. That hurt more than she expected, because emotional betrayal usually started long before physical betrayal did. Viola remembered the exact moment she first felt something changing between them. 10 months earlier. Charles had come home late after what he called a client dinner downtown. Viola stayed awake waiting for him on the living room couch with cold pasta sitting untouched beside her. When he finally walked through the front door after midnight, he barely looked at her. Just loosened his tie and muttered, "Long night." No kiss, no apology, no warmth. Then his phone buzzed. Charles grabbed it too fast, too protectively. Viola still remembered the expression on his face, illuminated by the screen for half a second before he locked it again. Not guilt. Excitement. That was when fear quietly entered her marriage. At the ballroom, Denise reached for her champagne. You confronted him yet? Viola hesitated, a few times, and a bitter laugh almost escaped her throat. He said, I was imagining things. Denise rolled her eyes immediately. Of course he did. Viola looked down briefly. The sad part was, for a while, she believed him. Charles had a way of speaking calmly enough to make other people question their instincts. Every confrontation somehow ended with Viola apologizing for being emotional, while Charles positioned himself as the exhausted husband dealing with unnecessary suspicion. At first she fought harder. Then she started doubting herself. Then came the hotel receipt. Viola could still remember standing alone inside their laundry room 3 months earlier, while emptying Charles's suit pockets before dry cleaning day. Folded receipt. Downtown Miami Hotel, 1 king suite. 2 guests. Her chest tightened painfully, just remembering it. When Charles came home that evening, Viola placed the receipt quietly on the kitchen counter between them. No yelling, no accusations, just silence. Charles stared at it for 3 long seconds before looking up calmly. It was for a client. A king suite? He didn't even flinch. The hotel made a mistake. That answer sat between them like poison, because both of them knew it was a lie. But Charles kept eating dinner afterward like the conversation barely mattered. And somehow, that hurt worse than screaming would have. Back inside the ballroom, Viola watched Isabella laugh again, near the stage. Too comfortable, too familiar. Denise followed her gaze carefully. You know something happened between them, don't you? Viola finally nodded once. Very small, very slow. Denise exhaled heavily under her breath. Oh, baby. Viola hated pity, especially tonight. So she straightened slightly in her chair and forced composure back into her expression before nearby guests noticed too much. A wealthy couple approached their table smiling politely. Viola, darling, you look beautiful tonight. Viola smiled automatically. Thank you. The woman glanced toward Charles across the ballroom. You and your husband are becoming Miami royalty at this point. Viola nearly choked on the irony. Instead, she nodded gracefully. That's kind of you. Performance. Everything lately felt like performance. The couple eventually moved on toward another table, while Denise watched Viola carefully again. You don't gotta keep pretending around me. That sentence almost cracked something inside her, because pretending had become exhausting. Viola lowered her voice quietly. I don't even recognize him anymore. Denise stayed silent. Good. Silence felt kinder than fake reassurance right now. Viola looked toward the ballroom ceiling briefly, blinking away emotion before continuing. He used to tell me everything. Her voice softened with memory. When he landed his first big investor, he called me crying in the middle of the street. Denise smiled faintly. I remember that. He used to bring me coffee during late-night grading when I was finishing school. Viola laughed quietly to herself. He once drove 40 minutes at 2 in the morning because I mentioned craving cheesecake. That version of Charles felt so far away now, he almost seemed imaginary. Success changed him slowly. Not all at once. Little things first. Longer work nights. More time on his phone. Shorter conversations at dinner. Less eye contact. Less touching. Then eventually, less kindness. The ballroom lights dimmed slightly as event staff prepared for speeches later in the evening. Soft conversations blended together beneath clinking silverware and distant jazz music. And still Charles hadn't come near her once. Viola stared at him across the room, while something painful settled deeper inside her chest. A month earlier, she woke up at 1:14 in the morning and noticed Charles missing from bed beside her. She found him downstairs standing near the kitchen island, texting someone while smiling at his phone. Smiling. At 1 in the morning. The second he noticed her standing there, the smile disappeared instantly. Who are you texting? She asked quietly. Charles locked his screen immediately. Work. Viola remembered looking at him for several seconds, then saying softly, You're lying. Instead of denying it, Charles got angry. That's when she truly knew. Because innocent people usually defended themselves. Guilty people attacked your reaction instead. Back in the ballroom, Isabella leaned close toward Charles again while fixing something near his collar. Too intimate. too natural. Viola looked away immediately this time, not because she doubted herself anymore, because she was tired. So unbelievably tired. Tired of clues. Tired of pretending. Tired of carrying humiliation privately while Charles moved through life untouched by consequences. Denise suddenly leaned closer again. Viola. Something in her tone felt serious. Viola looked up. Denise nodded subtly toward the stage. Charles had just spoken quietly with one of the event coordinators before adjusting his suit jacket and glancing slowly around the ballroom. His expression looked different now, focused, anticipating something. Then his eyes landed briefly on Viola again, and this time he smiled, not warmly, not lovingly, like a man sitting on a secret. A cold feeling traveled slowly down Viola's spine, because suddenly she understood something terrifying. Tonight wasn't just another uncomfortable gala. Something was about to happen, and deep down, the woman who already knew her marriage was dying finally realized she might be moments away from watching it die publicly. The uneasy feeling in Viola's chest kept growing while Charles stood near the stage speaking quietly with event staff. Around the ballroom, conversations continued normally. People laughed. Champagne glasses clinked softly. Silverware scraped lightly against expensive plates. But somehow, everything suddenly felt far away. Viola couldn't explain it fully, only that her instincts had started screaming at her. Denise noticed her expression immediately. What? Viola kept staring toward Charles. I don't know. Charles adjusted the cuff of his tuxedo calmly, before accepting a champagne glass from a passing waiter. Even from across the ballroom, he looked composed, controlled, too controlled, like a man preparing himself mentally for something important. Then he glanced toward Isabella, and Isabella gave the smallest nod. Viola felt her stomach drop instantly. Denise saw it too. Oh, hell no. Near the stage, one of the event coordinators stepped aside while Charles reached for a microphone resting on the podium. The ballroom lights dimmed slightly. A few guests turned their attention toward the stage automatically. Then came the sound. Ting, ting, ting. Charles lightly tapped his spoon against the side of his champagne glass, while smiling confidently at the crowd. Slowly, conversations faded. People returned to their seats, phones lowered. Waiters paused beside tables. Within seconds, the massive ballroom became quiet. Charles stepped fully onto the stage beneath warm golden lights while applause scattered throughout the room. There he is, someone whispered proudly nearby. Viola's chest tightened. Across giant digital screens behind the stage, smiling photos of Charles and Viola rotated beside logos for charities and corporate sponsors. The irony made her feel sick. Charles adjusted the microphone smoothly. Good evening, everyone. More applause followed. He thanked investors first, then local organizations, sponsors, community leaders. His voice sounded polished enough to belong on television. Every sentence flowed with practiced confidence, while guests nodded approvingly throughout the ballroom. Denise leaned toward Viola quietly. He really loves hearing himself talk. Usually that would have made Viola smile. Tonight it didn't. Because something underneath Charles's performance felt wrong. His energy looked almost excited now, like a man waiting impatiently for the real moment to begin. Then his tone shifted. And tonight, Charles said slowly, scanning the ballroom with dramatic timing, I want to celebrate something even more important than success. The room stayed attentive. Honesty. Viola froze. Not physically. Emotionally, something cold wrapped around her ribs. Charles smiled wider beneath the stage lights. Because there comes a point in life when pretending helps nobody. Several guests exchanged confused looks. Others laughed politely, unsure where the speech was going. Denise muttered under her breath, "What is this?" Viola already knew, or at least, part of her did. The terrified part that had spent months watching her marriage collapse quietly behind closed doors. Charles slowly turned his head toward the right side of the ballroom, toward Isabella, and smiled. "Isabella," he said warmly into the microphone, "come up here for a second." The room changed instantly, not loudly, subtly, a shift in energy, a wave of confusion, The beginning of discomfort. Viola felt it immediately. So did everyone else. Several people looked toward Isabella, then toward Viola, then back toward Charles. Nobody understood yet, but they knew something wasn't normal. Isabella placed one hand lightly against her chest, pretending surprise. "Oh my God," Denise whispered. Viola couldn't move, couldn't even blink correctly, while Isabella slowly made her way toward the stage in silver heels that clicked softly against the ballroom floor. She looked nervous now, but not shocked. That detail pierced Viola harder than anything else, because nervous meant preparation. Nervous meant awareness. Nervous meant this had already been discussed beforehand. Charles reached for Isabella's hand while helping her onto the stage. Then he kept holding it. Gasps spread quietly across nearby tables. A woman near the back whispered, "Wait, is that his assistant?" Another voice answered softly, "His wife is literally sitting right there." Viola felt hundreds of eyes slowly turning toward her table now. Heat rose behind her eyes immediately. Not tears yet. Humiliation. Charles wrapped an arm around Isabella's waist, casually, comfortably, like he wanted the entire ballroom understanding exactly what they were seeing. Denise stared toward the stage in disbelief. This man has lost his damn mind. Charles laughed lightly into the microphone, while Isabella stood stiffly beside him beneath the lights. "There's really no easy way to say this," he announced dramatically. The ballroom became completely still, but life's too short to stay in relationships that no longer make you happy. Silence. Heavy silence. Viola stopped hearing clearly for a moment. Everything around her sounded distant, muted, like her body was protecting her mind from fully processing what was happening. Charles continued speaking. "Viola and I," he sighed carefully, "have been struggling privately for a long time." Denise cursed quietly beside her. "But sometimes," Charles continued smoothly, pulling Isabella slightly closer, "you meet someone who reminds you what happiness actually feels like." A shocked murmur spread instantly across the ballroom. Someone dropped a fork nearby. Another woman covered her mouth, and suddenly every eye in the room landed directly on Viola. Some people looked horrified, others looked fascinated. A few had already lifted their phones, because people loved disaster when it belonged to somebody else. Charles finally looked directly at Viola from the stage, and smiled. That smile broke something inside her. Not because it looked happy, because it looked cruel, calculated, like he wanted this moment witnessed publicly. "You deserve honesty too, Viola," he said into the microphone. Denise pushed her chair back immediately. "Viola, we're leaving." But Viola didn't stand. Not yet. Because all at once, everything started making sense. The emotional distance, the arrogance tonight, the excitement in Charles's face, Isabella's nervousness, the rehearsed speech. This wasn't impulsive. This was planned humiliation. Carefully planned. Charles wanted control over the narrative, wanted the audience, wanted sympathy, wanted admiration for his honesty. And somehow, that realization stopped the pain from trembling inside her. The heartbreak suddenly became calm, dangerously calm. Viola slowly placed her wineglass beside her untouched dinner plate. The movement alone drew attention from nearby tables. Denise looked at her carefully. "Baby." But Viola was already standing. The ballroom grew quieter somehow as her chair slid backward softly against the floor. Charles watched her with confidence, still sitting comfortably across his face. He thought he understood what happened next. Crying, anger, public embarrassment. He still believed he controlled the room. Viola stepped away from the table slowly. Her heels clicked softly against polished marble, while guests moved slightly aside to clear a path toward the stage. Nobody spoke now. Even the jazz band had stopped completely. Isabella shifted uncomfortably beside Charles as Viola approached closer. Interesting, because suddenly, the mistress didn't look confident anymore. She looked afraid. Viola climbed the stage steps carefully without rushing once. Charles extended the microphone toward her with fake patience. "You want to say something?" he asked smoothly, that smug expression again. The same expression he wore during arguments, whenever he believed he'd already won. Viola took the microphone slowly from his hand. Then she turned toward the crowd and said absolutely nothing. 1 second passed, then another. The silence became unbearable almost immediately. Charles's smile weakened slightly. Guests shifted in their seats. Someone coughed nervously near the back. Even the waiters stood frozen. Viola finally looked directly at Charles. "You could have divorced me privately." Her voice was soft, steady, but somehow the words landed harder than yelling would have. Charles swallowed once. Viola continued staring into his eyes. "You could have left respectfully." Dead silence. Then her expression hardened just slightly. But instead, a pause. "You needed an audience." The atmosphere inside the ballroom changed instantly. Charles looked uncomfortable for the first time all night. Viola slowly turned toward Isabella. "And you?" Isabella straightened defensively. Viola's voice never rose. "You sat in my kitchen eating my food while sleeping with my husband." Gasps erupted quietly across the room. Charles stepped forward quickly. "Okay, enough." "No," Viola interrupted calmly. That calmness frightened him now. Because calm meant clarity. And for the first time that night, Charles realized Viola wasn't breaking apart in front of him. She was standing up. Viola tightened her grip around the microphone slightly before saying the sentence that locked the entire ballroom into silence. For once, a pause. "We're absolutely doing this." Charles stared at Viola like he no longer recognized the woman standing beside him. A few minutes ago, he controlled everything inside that ballroom. The attention, the narrative, the audience. Now all of it felt unstable. Viola stood beneath the stage lights holding the microphone calmly, while hundreds of wealthy guests watched with the kind of uncomfortable focus people usually reserved for car accidents they couldn't stop staring at. But Viola wasn't yelling, wasn't crying, wasn't begging. That unsettled Charles more than anger would have, because he knew how to handle emotional reactions. He knew how to interrupt tears, how to redirect arguments, how to make people feel unreasonable for reacting to his behavior. But calmness gave him nothing to fight against. Beside him, Isabella shifted awkwardly in her heels while avoiding eye contact with the crowd. Earlier, she looked confident walking onto the stage. Now she looked exposed. Viola slowly lowered the microphone slightly before looking out across the ballroom. "You know what's interesting?" she asked quietly. Nobody answered. Her voice remained controlled enough that people leaned forward just to hear her clearly. "The saddest part about betrayal isn't always the cheating." Charles folded his arms tightly. Viola noticed. "Good. It's realizing someone had plenty of opportunities to stop hurting you." She paused briefly. "And chose not to." That landed hard across the room, not dramatically, personally. A woman near the front table lowered her eyes toward her lap immediately. Even some of the men looked uncomfortable now. Charles forced a short laugh into his microphone. "Viola, emotions are high right now." His tone sounded lighter than his face looked. "We should probably handle this privately." Denise scoffed loudly from below the stage. "Oh, now he wants privacy." Several nearby guests exchanged glances. Charles ignored them, but his jaw tightened. Viola turned toward him slowly. "You lost the right to private conversations the second you made me part of your performance." The words hit him instantly, because they were true. Everything tonight had been designed like a public campaign. The dramatic speech, the audience, the timing, the stage lights. Charles wanted control over how this story looked. He just never expected Viola refusing humiliation publicly. Viola looked down briefly at the microphone in her hand before continuing. "For months, I kept asking myself what I did wrong." Charles's expression shifted carefully. Not guilt, exactly. Discomfort. Viola laughed softly to herself. Not happily, more like someone exhausted by their own memories. "I changed little things first." She touched one curl lightly near her ear. "My hair," then looked down at herself briefly. "My weight." The ballroom remained completely focused on her now. "I cooked more." Another pause. "Complimented him more." Pause. "Argued less." Charles looked away, because every word sounded familiar. Not to the audience. To him, These were real conversations, real efforts, real attempts Viola made quietly while he emotionally disappeared from the marriage. Viola's voice softened further. You start doing strange things when somebody you love keeps pulling away from you. That line changed something inside the room, because now she no longer sounded like a humiliated wife trying to win sympathy. She sounded human, and humans were harder to dismiss. Charles suddenly stepped closer toward her. Okay, enough with the victim act. A few people visibly reacted to that sentence. Viola turned toward him slowly. Victim act? Charles straightened defensively. You're acting like this marriage falling apart is completely my fault. There it is, Denise muttered under her breath. Charles exhaled sharply before looking toward the audience. Do you know how impossible it's been living with someone emotionally checked out all the time? Viola blinked once slowly, not shocked, just disappointed. Charles continued pushing forward, now that he finally found momentum again. She stopped trying a long time ago. That accusation lingered heavily between them, and for half a second, some people in the audience almost considered it. Charles noticed immediately. That tiny shift gave him confidence again. She was always tired. He shrugged dramatically, always distracted, always working. Viola stared at him quietly while he spoke, not interrupting. That made him increasingly uncomfortable, because the longer she stayed calm, the more emotional he sounded. She stopped making this marriage feel like home. Silence. Charles looked around the ballroom as if searching for agreement. Instead, he mostly found discomfort, because people were starting to notice something important. Every sentence Viola spoke sounded painful. Every sentence Charles spoke sounded defensive. Viola finally lifted the microphone again. You know what's amazing? Charles looked irritated already. I spent so much time trying to save your image. She tilted her head slightly, that I almost lost myself protecting it. That sentence shifted the atmosphere again. Charles swallowed once. Viola stepped slightly closer toward him beneath the bright stage lights. Not aggressively, steadily. For a whole year, I defended you to everybody. Her eyes locked directly onto his. My family. Pause. My friends. Pause. Myself. Charles said nothing now, because he remembered every lie she protected him with, every excuse she made publicly, every moment she covered his absence instead of exposing him. Viola's voice lowered painfully. I kept convincing myself the man I married was still somewhere inside you. That hurt him. Actually hurt him. People noticed immediately. The confidence Charles walked onto that stage with earlier had started disappearing piece by piece. Viola saw it too. And oddly enough, watching him unravel emotionally didn't make her feel victorious. Just tired. Very tired. She looked toward the audience again. You know the dangerous thing about quiet heartbreak? Nobody moved. By the time the person causing it notices the damage, her eyes return slowly toward Charles. You've already learned how to survive without them emotionally. That sentence hit him harder than anything else she said all night, because suddenly Charles realized something terrifying. Viola wasn't fighting for the marriage anymore, and for the first time since stepping onto that stage, he looked genuinely afraid. The fear on Charles's face disappeared almost as quickly as it arrived, not because he recovered emotionally, because instinct took over. Men like Charles survived uncomfortable situations by regaining control fast, even when they were wrong, especially when they were wrong. He straightened his tuxedo jacket carefully before forcing another tight smile toward the audience. Look, he said calmly, I'm not pretending I handled everything perfectly. Viola watched him quietly, already recognizing the shift. Damage control. Charles stepped closer to the microphone again. But marriages are complicated. A few people nodded automatically. That encouraged him. We've both made mistakes. There it was. The first attempt to divide accountability evenly. Viola lowered her eyes briefly. Not from shame, from exhaustion, because she already knew this version of Charles too. The polished version, the reasonable version. The man who could make selfishness sound mature, if given enough time. Charles sighed heavily for effect. For the last year, Things between us haven't been good. Viola stayed silent. She stopped talking to me. He shrugged slightly. She stopped being present. Denise folded her arms below the stage immediately. Oh, brother. Charles ignored her again. We were living like roommates. Viola slowly lifted her eyes back toward him, then asked quietly, "Do you remember Jackson Memorial last August?" Charles stopped talking instantly. A small pause. But long enough. Viola noticed immediately. So did the audience. Charles's expression tightened carefully. "This isn't the time for that." "No," Viola replied softly. "This is exactly the time." The ballroom became still again. Not dramatic stillness. Focused stillness. The kind where people sensed something real was finally about to surface. Viola adjusted her grip around the microphone. "Last August," she continued quietly, "my mother had a stroke." Several guests visibly reacted. A woman near the stage lowered her champagne glass slowly. Viola's voice remained steady, though emotion pressed harder beneath it now. She collapsed inside her kitchen on a Tuesday morning. Charles looked away immediately. Viola noticed. Good. She almost died. The room stayed silent. Not because people were shocked someone had a sick parent, because they suddenly understood where this conversation was heading. Viola inhaled carefully before continuing. "I spent 17 nights sleeping in a hospital chair." Images moved through her mind instantly. Cold hospital blankets, vending machine coffee, the sound of heart monitors after midnight, and loneliness, so much loneliness. "I remember watching other husbands walk into those hospital rooms holding flowers for their wives." Her voice weakened slightly for the first time tonight, not enough to lose control, just enough to sound real. They sat beside them. A pause. They helped them eat. Another pause. They stayed. Charles rubbed the back of his neck uncomfortably. Viola looked directly at him. "You know where my husband was?" Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. Viola answered for him. "Aruba." A sharp murmur spread instantly through the ballroom. Charles closed his eyes briefly. Beside him, Isabella stiffened completely. Viola saw it. That reaction confirmed everything publicly without needing another word. Charles immediately stepped forward. "Viola, you told me it was a business conference." Her tone never rose. That made the betrayal feel heavier somehow. "You called me from beaches while I sat beside my mother wondering why my husband suddenly stopped answering after midnight." The room shifted emotionally all over again. Earlier, this looked like cheating. Now, it looked heartless. Viola looked toward the audience slowly. "My mother kept asking where Charles was." Her throat tightened slightly around the memory. "And every single day." A pause. "I lied for him." Charles lowered his head briefly. That hit harder than he expected. Because it was true, Viola protected him constantly, even while breaking privately. "I told her he was busy." Viola swallowed carefully. "I told her investors needed him." A faint, bitter smile crossed her face. "I told her he loved us." Charles looked trapped now. Viola noticed sweat forming lightly near his temple beneath the ballroom lights. Good. For once, he looked uncomfortable carrying the truth publicly instead of her. Denise shook her head slowly below the stage. "That's cold," she muttered. A few guests quietly agreed. Charles suddenly lifted his microphone again. "Okay, enough." His voice came out sharper this time. Defensive, not confident. "You're acting like I abandoned you." Viola stared at him carefully. "You did." Simple, direct, no dramatic speech attached. And somehow, that honesty landed harder than anything else. Charles exhaled harshly before running one hand across his jaw. "You pushed me away too." There it was again. Blame, redistribution. You became emotionally unavailable. Viola almost laughed hearing that. Almost. Instead, she asked quietly, "Emotionally unavailable?" Charles stepped forward defensively. "Yes." Viola tilted her head slightly. "While my mother was recovering from a stroke." Charles said nothing. "While I was handling hospital paperwork alone." Still nothing. "While I was driving between work and intensive care every day by myself." The silence around him started feeling dangerous now. because suddenly every excuse sounded selfish the moment real details entered the conversation. Viola looked toward Isabella briefly, then back at Charles. "You know what's amazing?" Charles looked exhausted already. "You actually convinced yourself your loneliness mattered more than my pain." That sentence crushed whatever control he still thought he had left. Several people exchanged uncomfortable looks immediately, because now the audience no longer saw complicated marriage problems. They saw priorities. And Charles's priorities looked ugly. Viola's voice softened again. "The crazy part is—" She paused briefly. "I still defended you." Charles blinked once, slowly. Even now, hearing that hurt him, because he remembered those hospital calls. Viola never screamed, never exposed him publicly, never embarrassed him. She protected him while he betrayed her. Viola looked down toward the ballroom floor for a moment before continuing, "I kept thinking, maybe stress changed you." Her eyes lifted slowly again. "Maybe success changed you." Another pause. "Maybe pressure changed you." Then her expression hardened slightly. "But eventually, I realized something worse." Charles swallowed hard. Viola stared directly into his eyes. "You knew exactly what you were doing." The room felt emotionally different now. Earlier guests watched out of curiosity. Now many looked genuinely disturbed. Because public cheating was one thing. Abandoning your wife during her mother's medical crisis to vacation with another woman? That exposed character. Beside Charles, Isabella folded her arms tightly across her chest now, not confident anymore. Protective, uncomfortable. Viola noticed that too. Interesting. Because reality always looked uglier once fantasy became public. Charles suddenly laughed once under his breath, not amused, cornered. "You're making this sound worse than it was." That sentence changed the room immediately. Viola stared at him carefully. Worse than it was? For the first time all night, visible disappointment crossed several faces around the ballroom, openly. Not toward Viola, toward him. Charles realized it too late. The audience wasn't debating whether he cheated anymore. They were judging the kind of man who minimized emotional abandonment after getting caught publicly humiliating his wife. Viola slowly nodded to herself, then lifted the microphone one more time. That right there, her eyes never left his, is the real problem. Charles's face tightened. Viola's voice dropped softer now. "You still think this night is about protecting yourself." Silence. "But the truth is—" A pause. "You stopped protecting the people who loved you a long time ago. And for the first time since stepping onto that stage." Charles had absolutely nothing to say back. Charles stood motionless beneath the ballroom lights, while silence pressed against him from every direction. Not the kind of silence that protected powerful people, the kind that exposed them. Earlier that night, attention felt easy, comfortable, controlled. Now every eye in the room seemed to be studying him differently. Not like a successful businessman, like a man whose image had cracked open publicly. Charles loosened his jaw slowly before lifting the microphone again. "You're acting like I'm some terrible person." His voice sounded strained now, despite his effort to remain composed. Viola looked at him quietly, not angry. That somehow unsettled him more. Charles forced a dry laugh. This marriage was broken long before tonight. Viola never interrupted. That made him increasingly uneasy, because every time she stayed calm, he sounded more emotional, trying to defend himself. Charles gestured vaguely toward the audience. "We've both been unhappy." Viola tilted her head slightly. "Unhappy people file for divorce, Charles." The room stayed focused on her instantly. They don't invite their mistress on stage to embarrass their wife. A sharp reaction moved through several nearby tables. Not loud, but visible. Charles swallowed hard. Beside him, Isabella shifted again in her heels, while staring toward the ballroom floor now, instead of the crowd. The confidence she entered the stage with earlier had disappeared completely. Viola noticed. Good, because reality felt very different once fantasy lost privacy. Charles exhaled heavily through his nose. "You keep making this look cruel." Viola blinked slowly. "Look cruel?" She repeated the words carefully, like she genuinely wanted to understand them. Charles immediately stepped forward defensively. I was trying to be honest. That almost made Denise laugh below the stage. Oh, now humiliation is honesty. A few people nearby nodded quietly. Charles ignored them again, but he looked rattled now. Viola studied him for several long seconds before speaking. You know what's interesting? Charles looked exhausted already. You spent months lying to me privately. A pause. Then suddenly decided honesty mattered once you had an audience. That sentence landed hard, because everyone inside the ballroom understood exactly what she meant. This wasn't confession, it was performance. Charles rubbed one hand across his forehead. You don't understand the pressure I've been under. There it was again, self-pity dressed as explanation. Viola almost looked sad hearing it. Not emotional, disappointed. The pressure? She asked softly. Charles nodded quickly. Yes, the business. Investors. Expectations. Everything. Viola stared at him carefully, then said quietly, "And somehow betraying me helped with that?" Several guests looked away immediately after hearing it. Because excuses always sounded uglier once spoken out loud publicly, Charles's expression hardened slightly. You weren't exactly easy to live with either. Denise threw both hands up instantly. Oh my God! Viola remained still. Charles continued anyway. You pushed me away emotionally. That line sounded weaker now than it did earlier, not because the words changed, because the audience no longer trusted him. Viola nodded slowly to herself, then looked out toward the ballroom. For a long time, she said quietly, I really believed love could fix anything. The room softened emotionally again. Not sympathy, recognition. I thought patience mattered. Pause. Loyalty mattered. Another pause. Commitment mattered. Her eyes slowly returned toward Charles. But eventually you learn something painful. Charles looked at her carefully. Some people don't want healing. Silence. They want admiration. That sentence cut directly through him. Because, deep down, Charles knew it was true. Viola saw the reaction immediately. A tiny shift in his face. A brief flash of shame. Real shame. Not embarrassment over being caught. Embarrassment over being understood completely. Viola continued calmly. You stopped loving me the moment I started seeing the real version of you. Charles looked away first. Not her. The audience noticed, and that changed everything. Because powerful men rarely looked small publicly. Tonight, Charles suddenly did. Viola's voice lowered slightly. You loved being admired. Pause. You loved attention. Pause. You loved feeling important. Then she tilted her head slightly. But love? A painful smile crossed her face. Love requires character when nobody's watching. The ballroom stayed completely still. Even Isabella looked shaken hearing that, because suddenly, this no longer sounded like a cheating scandal. It sounded like truth. The kind people carried home afterward. Charles laughed quietly under his breath again. But now the sound felt empty. You think you're perfect? Viola answered immediately, no. That response surprised him. And the audience too. Viola shook her head softly. I made mistakes. A pause. I ignored problems. Another pause. I stayed quiet too long. Charles looked confused now, because he expected defensiveness, not honesty. Viola looked directly into his eyes again. But I never stopped respecting your humanity. That hit him harder than yelling could have, because tonight he had done the opposite to her publicly. Viola slowly stepped closer beneath the stage lights. Not aggressively, steadily. And that's the difference between us. Charles swallowed hard. Viola lowered her voice almost to a whisper now. I was trying to save our marriage. A pause. You were trying to win. That sentence finished him emotionally. The room felt it instantly, because suddenly every moment tonight made sense. The stage, the speech, the performance, the audience. Charles never wanted closure. He wanted control. And now, he no longer had it. Beside him, Isabella quietly stepped backward. Small movement, but noticeable. Viola noticed immediately. Interesting. Even Isabella no longer wanted standing beside him publicly. Charles looked around the ballroom desperately now, but instead of admiration, he found judgment, discomfort, disappointment, distance. People avoided eye contact with him. A few investors whispered quietly among themselves. Several women stared openly with disgust. For the first time all night, Charles looked isolated, completely isolated. Viola saw it happen in real time. And, strangely enough, she didn't feel satisfaction, just clarity, the kind that arrived after carrying pain too long. Charles looked back toward her one final time. His voice sounded smaller now. Viola. But he had no real ending to the sentence, no defense left, no explanation left, no performance left, just consequences. Viola studied him silently for several seconds. Then she spoke softly into the microphone. You didn't embarrass me tonight, Charles. The ballroom held its breath. Viola's eyes never left his. You exposed yourself. Silence. Deep silence. Then, somewhere near the back of the ballroom, one person started clapping. A single sharp clap. Then another. Then another. The sound spread slowly across the room, table by table, while Charles stood frozen beneath the lights, watching the audience slip away from him completely. Not because Viola destroyed him loudly, because she told the truth calmly. And sometimes, truth humiliated people more than revenge ever could. The applause faded slowly across the ballroom until only scattered claps remained near the back tables. Then even those disappeared, leaving Charles standing beneath the lights, looking emotionally exposed in a way expensive suits could not hide. Viola watched him quietly, and against her own wishes, a memory surfaced, not of tonight, not of betrayal, of a tiny apartment years earlier, where Charles once danced with her barefoot in the kitchen because the electricity went out during a thunderstorm. The memory hit her suddenly enough to hurt. Back then, neither of them had money. Their apartment sat above a noisy laundromat in Fort Lauderdale, with weak air conditioning and pipes that rattled whenever neighbors showered too long. But Charles used to laugh more then, real laughter. Not the polished social version he performed now at charity galas and business dinners. Viola remembered sitting cross-legged on their kitchen counter one summer night, eating takeout noodles straight from the carton, while Charles practiced investor pitches dramatically across the room, pretending he was already successful. You're overacting, she laughed. I'm inspiring confidence, he argued. You sound ridiculous. Charles pointed at her with chopsticks. When I'm rich, remember this moment. She smiled softly, just remembering it, because once upon a time, Charles felt safe. The ballroom around her blurred slightly while memories kept rising one after another. Charles bringing her coffee while she studied for graduate exams. Charles rubbing her feet after 12-hour workdays. Charles crying quietly beside her at her father's funeral because he hated seeing her hurt. That version of him existed, which somehow made tonight more painful, because strangers believed Charles suddenly became cruel overnight. Viola knew better. People changed slowly. Little compromises first. Small, selfish choices. Tiny lies repeated often enough to become personality. Charles noticed her staring at him now. Something about her expression unsettled him immediately. Not anger, sadness. And somehow, sadness felt heavier. Viola lifted the microphone slowly again. You know what the hardest part is? Her voice sounded softer now. The audience leaned in again immediately. People probably think I hate him. Charles looked confused by that. Viola shook her head faintly. I don't. A few guests exchanged surprised looks. Beside Charles, Isabella glanced toward him carefully for the first time in several minutes. Viola looked directly at Charles beneath the stage lights. I miss him. That sentence changed the emotional atmosphere inside the ballroom instantly. Because suddenly, this wasn't just humiliation anymore. It was grief. Charles stared at her silently. Viola smiled sadly to herself. The version of you before all this. She gestured lightly around the ballroom. The money, the attention, the image. Charles lowered his eyes briefly, and deep down, part of him knew exactly what she meant. Viola continued carefully. You used to call me during lunch breaks just to ask how my day was going. The memory softened her voice unintentionally. You used to leave little notes inside my purse before work. Denise lowered her head quietly near the front of the stage, because she remembered those days too. Viola laughed softly through lingering emotion. One time you drove across town at midnight because I said I wanted cheesecake. A few people smiled faintly hearing that. Even Charles almost did. Almost. Then reality returned again. Viola's expression shifted carefully. You used to look at me like I mattered. Silence. Not uncomfortable silence this time. Heartbroken silence. Charles swallowed hard. Because that accusation carried truth deeper than the affair itself. Viola wasn't just mourning betrayal. She was mourning disappearance. The disappearance of the man she married. Charles finally spoke quietly. I did love you. The words came out rougher than he intended. Viola looked at him carefully. I know. That answer shattered something inside him immediately. Because she meant it. She truly had loved him once. And believed he loved her too. That honesty hurt more than anger would have. Charles rubbed one hand across his face slowly. You make it sound like I became some monster. Viola shook her head softly. No. A pause. I think you became addicted. Charles frowned slightly. To what? Viola studied him carefully before answering. Being admired. The room stayed completely still. Because suddenly, everything about Charles made emotional sense. The constant networking. The obsession with appearances, the performative charm, the attention addiction. Viola continued quietly. The more successful you became, the less peace seemed enough for you. Charles looked away again, not because she was wrong, because she understood him too clearly. Viola's voice lowered. You stopped wanting love. Pause. You wanted validation. Isabella's posture stiffened beside him immediately. That line hit her too. Viola noticed. Interesting. Because for the first time all night, Isabella looked less like a confident mistress and more like a woman realizing she may have been chosen for ego instead of connection. Charles exhaled slowly through his nose. That's not fair. Viola tilted her head slightly. Isn't it? Charles said nothing, because somewhere deep underneath his embarrassment, underneath his defensiveness, underneath his collapsing image, he knew something terrifying. Viola still understood him better than anyone else in that ballroom, even now, especially now. And suddenly the applause earlier no longer felt like the worst part of tonight. The worst part was realizing the woman he publicly humiliated still remembered the version of him worth loving, while he barely recognized himself anymore. Charles loosened his grip around the microphone slowly, while Viola's words lingered over the ballroom like smoke nobody could escape from. You wanted validation. That sentence kept replaying inside his head, because it sounded dangerously close to the truth, and Charles hated truth whenever it exposed weakness. Especially publicly. The ballroom felt different now. Earlier, guests watched the confrontation like entertainment. Now people looked emotionally invested, studying them carefully, listening harder, because somewhere during the argument the story stopped being about cheating alone. It became about what success does to people who never learn how to separate admiration from self-worth. Viola looked toward Charles quietly, and another memory surfaced. The first major business award he ever won, 5 years earlier. Back then, Charles still came home excited instead of entitled. He burst through their front door, holding the trophy above his head while shouting her name across the apartment, like a kid who couldn't believe his own luck. Viola. She came running from the kitchen laughing. What happened? Charles grabbed her around the waist and spun her across the living room. I got it. His eyes looked bright then. Alive. They picked me. Viola remembered kissing him so hard, he nearly dropped the award onto the hardwood floor. That night they celebrated with cheap champagne because real luxury still felt far away back then. Charles spent half the evening talking about helping people someday, building something meaningful, making his family proud. And for a while, he really meant those things. But success changed slowly. The first major investment deal led to bigger circles, bigger parties, bigger expectations. Then came the interviews, magazine features, business podcasts. exclusive charity events. And Charles loved all of it, not the opportunities, the attention. Viola noticed the shift before he did. At first it looked harmless. Longer mirror checks before events, practicing smiles for photographs, refreshing social media comments. Late at night, then slowly. Validation became emotional oxygen for him. Back in the ballroom, Charles looked toward the audience carefully again. Still searching for approval even now, Viola noticed immediately. That hurt in a strange way, because even during public collapse, part of him still wanted admiration. She lifted the microphone gently. "You know what I realized too late?" Charles looked at her warily. "The more strangers praised you." A pause. "The less you cared about the people who actually knew you." Several people visibly reacted to that line, because it sounded personal, accurate, dangerously honest. Charles forced a frustrated laugh. "That's ridiculous." Viola stayed calm. "Is it?" Charles rubbed his jaw tightly. "You think building a business is easy?" His voice sharpened slightly. "You think carrying pressure every day doesn't change people?" Viola nodded once. "I do." That surprised him briefly. "I know pressure changes people." Her eyes stayed fixed on him. "But pressure reveals character too." Silence. Charles looked away again. The problem wasn't that Viola misunderstood him. The problem was that she understood him too well. Viola continued carefully. "You stopped coming home emotionally." That sentence settled heavily inside the ballroom. "You'd sit beside me scrolling through comments while barely speaking." A pause. "You cared more about interviews than conversations." Another pause. "You started treating attention like proof you mattered." Charles shifted uncomfortably, because every word sounded familiar, not exaggerated. Observed, Viola remembered lying awake beside him countless nights, while blue phone light reflected across his face after midnight. At first, she thought he was stressed. Eventually she realized he was feeding something deeper, an emptiness. Success never satisfied. Charles suddenly looked irritated. "You act like I wasn't doing all this for us." Viola's expression softened sadly. "No," she replied quietly. "I think you stopped knowing who you were doing it for." That sentence hit him instantly, because somewhere deep down, Charles wasn't fully sure anymore either. The ballroom remained completely silent, while Viola continued speaking. "You used to care about peace." Pause. "Then eventually peace became boring to you." Charles frowned slightly. "What does that even mean?" Viola looked toward Isabella briefly before answering. "It means normal love stopped feeling exciting once people started worshipping you publicly." Isabella's face tightened immediately. Another direct hit. Viola noticed her discomfort growing more obvious now. Interesting. Because Isabella probably thought she was entering a glamorous relationship with a powerful man, not becoming part of a public emotional autopsy. Charles stepped forward again defensively. "You don't know what it feels like carrying expectations constantly." Viola almost smiled sadly hearing that. "Actually, I do." Charles blinked once. Viola lowered her voice carefully. "I carried your expectations for years." Silence. "I defended your image." Pause. "Protected your ego." Pause. "Supported your ambition." Then her eyes hardened slightly. "Even when it started destroying us privately." Charles looked emotionally cornered now, not because she yelled, because she spoke with painful precision. Denise folded her arms below the stage while watching him carefully. For the first time all night, Charles no longer looked powerful to her, just insecure. Viola inhaled slowly before continuing. "You want to know when I realized things were changing?" Charles stayed silent. "You stopped celebrating moments." A pause. "You started performing them." That line landed heavily, because it explained Charles perfectly. Every anniversary became social media content. Every donation became press coverage. Every romantic gesture became public. Nothing stayed intimate anymore. Charles cared more about appearing loving than actually protecting love privately. Viola remembered one particular dinner almost a year earlier. Charles rented out an expensive rooftop restaurant for their anniversary. Photographers captured them arriving hand in hand, while strangers online flooded comments calling them relationship goals. That same night after dinner, Charles spent 40 minutes responding to business emails while Viola sat across from him alone staring at untouched dessert. The audience never saw that part. They only saw the pictures afterward. Perfect smiles, luxury candles, designer clothes, performance, always performance. Back in the ballroom, Viola finally looked directly toward Isabella again, and honestly. Isabella stiffened. "I don't even think this affair started because he loved you." Charles's head snapped toward Viola immediately. "Stop." But Viola continued calmly. "I think she made you feel admired." The room became intensely still, because suddenly Isabella's role inside the relationship looked painfully different. Not soulmate, validation source. Viola's voice softened slightly. "She looked at you the way success trained you to expect people looking at you." Charles's face tightened, because deep down, he knew she was right again. Isabella complimented him constantly, admired everything he said, fed every insecurity hiding underneath his confidence. And somewhere along the way, Charles confused admiration with connection. Viola studied him carefully beneath the bright ballroom lights, then said quietly, "That's the tragedy of men like you." Charles stared back silently. "You become so addicted to feeling important." A pause. "That you stop recognizing real love while you still have it." The room felt emotionally heavier after that sentence, because suddenly Charles no longer looked like a powerful man escaping an unhappy marriage. He looked emotionally starving. A man who kept chasing applause because peace no longer felt loud enough inside him. And for the first time all night, Charles truly looked ashamed of himself. Charles had spent years believing he understood Viola completely. He understood her patience, her loyalty, her softness, most importantly. He understood her forgiveness, or at least he thought he did. That was why tonight was supposed to work differently. Even after the affair, even after the lies, even after the emotional distance, part of Charles still believed Viola would fight for him. Cry publicly, beg privately, hold on to the marriage harder than her own dignity, because that's what she had done every other time he disappointed her. She stayed. She explained his behavior gently to other people, made excuses for his absence, protected his image, while quietly bleeding emotionally beside him. Charles got used to that version of Viola, the version that still needed his love enough to tolerate his cruelty. But standing beneath those ballroom lights now, something felt terrifyingly different. Viola wasn't trying to win him back. She wasn't trying to compete with Isabella, wasn't demanding apologies, wasn't screaming for attention. She looked emotionally free of him, and Charles didn't realize until this exact moment how much power he drew from knowing she still cared deeply. That realization unsettled him harder than public embarrassment, because suddenly, he couldn't predict her anymore. Viola watched him quietly while tension moved visibly across his face. For the first time all night, Charles looked uncertain without hiding it well. His confidence had cracks in it now, small cracks, but growing. Beside him, Isabella folded her arms tightly across her chest while staring toward the audience instead of Charles. Another change. Earlier, she stayed physically close to him naturally, comfortably. Now there was distance between them. Not dramatic distance. Careful distance. Viola noticed immediately. Interesting. Because people built on fantasy often panic once reality enters the room publicly. Charles finally lifted the microphone again, but this time his voice sounded quieter, less polished. "Viola." He paused briefly, like he wasn't sure what sentence came next. That alone shocked her internally. Charles always knew what to say. Always. Even during arguments. Even while lying, words usually came easily to him. "Not tonight. You're acting like I never cared about you." Viola stared at him carefully, then answered honestly, "I think you cared about me once." That hurt him instantly. The ballroom felt it, because the sentence sounded final, not emotional, not angry. Final. Charles swallowed hard. "I still care about you." Viola lowered her eyes briefly before looking back up. and something inside her shifted quietly. Not rage, not heartbreak, acceptance. The kind that arrives after carrying disappointment too long. Because deep down, she finally understood something painful. Charles didn't want her love tonight. He wanted access to her emotional attachment. There was a difference. As long as Viola still cried over him, fought for him, needed him emotionally, Charles still felt powerful. But now she looked calm enough to survive losing him, and that terrified him. Charles stepped slightly closer toward her. "Can we stop doing this in front of everybody?" Earlier those words might have softened her. Not anymore. Viola studied his face carefully beneath the bright lights, and for the first time in months, she truly saw him clearly. Not the successful businessman, not the charming public figure, not the husband she spent years trying to save, just a deeply insecure man terrified of losing control over how people saw him. That realization changed something permanently inside her. Charles lowered his voice further. "We can fix this." Denise nearly laughed below the stage. Fix this? Now? After publicly humiliating her? But Viola remained calm, and somehow her calmness continued frightening Charles more than anger ever could, because he no longer recognized where her emotional breaking point existed. Viola lifted the microphone carefully. "You know what's strange?" Charles looked exhausted already. "I used to be scared of losing you." Her honesty hit him immediately. Viola nodded faintly to herself. "Every time we argued, I panicked." She remembered those nights vividly now, crying alone in bathrooms so Charles wouldn't accuse her of being dramatic, rehearsing conversations in her head before confronting him about lies, apologizing just to restore peace. She hated remembering that version of herself. "I kept thinking, if I loved you better." Her voice weakened slightly. "You'd become the man I missed again." Charles looked down immediately, because somewhere underneath his ego, he knew she truly tried. Viola continued quietly, "But eventually something inside me got tired." Silence, not angry. A pause, not hateful. Her eyes met his again, just tired. That word carried more pain than any insult could have. Charles rubbed one hand across his face slowly, because now he finally understood the real danger. Viola wasn't emotionally reacting anymore. She was emotionally detaching, and men like Charles rarely noticed detachment until it was too late to stop it. Beside him, Isabella shifted awkwardly again, then quietly stepped another small distance away. Charles noticed this time. His expression tightened instantly. Interesting, because suddenly he looked afraid of losing both women at once. Viola saw it happen in real time, the panic beneath his composure, the desperation slowly replacing arrogance. And strangely enough, watching him unravel emotionally didn't feel satisfying. Just sad, very sad, because once upon a time she truly believed Charles Whitmore would protect her heart forever. Now he looked like a stranger wearing pieces of the man she married. Charles looked toward her again. "This isn't who I wanted to become." The confession came quietly, accidentally honest. Viola believed him. That was the tragic part. People rarely wake up planning to destroy their relationships. They just keep choosing ego over intimacy little by little until love no longer recognizes itself. Viola inhaled slowly, while the ballroom remained completely silent around them. Then she said softly, "But it's still who you became." Charles closed his eyes briefly. That sentence landed deeper than public judgment, because it carried disappointment instead of hatred. And disappointment was harder surviving. Viola looked out toward the ballroom one final time before lowering the microphone slightly. The audience no longer mattered much to her now. Neither did appearances. For months she begged privately for reassurance from a man incapable of giving it honestly. Tonight, something ended quietly inside her. Not love completely, something more important, dependence. She no longer needed Charles to validate her worth emotionally, and deep down, Charles finally realized it. The woman, who once feared losing him, no longer feared him at all. The ballroom stayed painfully quiet after Viola's final words. The woman who once feared losing him no longer feared him at all. Charles felt that sentence settling deeper inside him with every passing second, because it was true. For years he always believed, no matter how badly things became, Viola would still emotionally reach for him eventually. Tonight, she stopped reaching, and suddenly, he felt the distance between them in a way that terrified him. Charles opened his mouth slightly like he wanted to speak again, but movement near the ballroom entrance interrupted everything. Several guests turned their heads first, then more followed. A subtle wave of attention spread quietly across the room. Viola looked toward the entrance, and immediately froze. "Mom?" Miss Evelyn stood near the ballroom doors, holding a cane carefully in one hand, while scanning the crowded room with visible confusion. Her church hat sat neatly against silver curls despite the late hour, and her soft lavender dress moved lightly as she stepped forward. Denise's eyes widened instantly. "Oh my God!" Viola's chest tightened painfully. Her mother wasn't supposed to attend tonight. After the stroke, Miss Evelyn still tired easily. Loud environments exhausted her. Viola specifically asked her to stay home and rest instead of attending the gala. But now she was here, and slowly realizing something was very wrong. The ballroom parted naturally as Miss Evelyn walked forward carefully between tables. Guests moved aside quietly while watching her approach the stage. Charles looked horrified, not publicly embarrassed, personally horrified, because Miss Evelyn loved him once, truly loved him. She defended him during arguments, prayed for his business, called him son for years, and now she was walking directly into the aftermath of his cruelty. Viola stepped down from the stage immediately. "Mum, you shouldn't be here." Miss Evelyn looked at her daughter's face carefully, then at Charles, then Isabella. Understanding arrived slowly across her expression, and the disappointment in her eyes felt devastating, not dramatic. Worse, quiet. Miss Evelyn reached Viola first and gently touched her cheek. "Baby girl." That softness broke something inside Viola instantly. All night she held herself together through humiliation, through exposure, through heartbreak. But the second her mother touched her, the strength cracked. Viola leaned forward suddenly into her mother's arms, while tears finally escaped down her face. Not loud crying, not collapse, just exhausted pain finally finding somewhere safe to land. Miss Evelyn wrapped one arm around her carefully despite her own physical weakness. "I got you," she whispered softly. Simple words, but healing words. The ballroom remained completely silent, while Viola cried quietly against her mother's shoulder. Charles stared at them both, feeling something unfamiliar tightening painfully inside his chest. Shame, real shame, because for the first time tonight, this no longer felt like a public scandal. It felt personal, human. Miss Evelyn gently rubbed Viola's back while looking toward Charles over her daughter's shoulder. The disappointment on her face nearly destroyed him. Charles stepped closer slowly. "Miss Evelyn, Stop." Her voice wasn't loud, but it stopped him immediately. Miss Evelyn straightened carefully while still holding Viola's hand. "I defended you." Charles lowered his eyes instantly. "You sat in my house eating Sunday dinner. Silence. You prayed beside my family." Charles swallowed hard. "And this? How you love my daughter." Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted, because there was no defense for that question. Charles looked emotionally smaller now, standing beneath the stage lights than he had all night. Miss Evelyn shook her head slowly. "Wealth without character is just expensive emptiness." That sentence settled heavily across the ballroom. Several guests looked away immediately. Even some of Charles's investors appeared uncomfortable hearing it spoken so plainly, because deep down, everybody knew she was right. Charles built an empire protecting appearances while privately neglecting the people closest to him emotionally. And now the image was collapsing publicly in real time. Beside the stage, Isabella quietly stepped farther backward again. Viola noticed through blurry eyes. Interesting, because now even Isabella looked unsure about standing beside him publicly. Charles rubbed his forehead slowly. "Miss Evelyn, I never wanted things to happen like this." Miss Evelyn stared at him carefully. "But they did. Simple, direct, impossible to escape." Charles looked toward Viola desperately. I made mistakes. Denise folded her arms instantly. Mistakes? She shook her head. No, this was intentional. Charles looked emotionally cornered now. Every attempt at defending himself sounded weaker the moment real pain entered the room. Miss Evelyn squeezed Viola's hand gently again, and Viola realized something important in that moment. All year long she kept carrying this marriage alone emotionally, protecting it, excusing it, surviving it quietly. But standing beside her mother now, she no longer felt alone inside the pain. Charles looked toward Viola again, and suddenly he truly saw her, not as his wife, not as part of his public image, not as emotional security waiting patiently for him forever. He saw a wounded woman finally being protected by people who genuinely loved her. And, deep down, Charles realized something terrifying. For the first time since their marriage began, Viola no longer needed him emotionally to survive. That realization hollowed him out from the inside, because attention from strangers suddenly felt worthless compared to losing the one person who once loved him without conditions. And under the bright ballroom lights, Charles Whitmore finally began understanding the full weight of what he destroyed. The ballroom no longer felt like a celebration. Earlier that night, the room glowed with polished confidence. Champagne, laughter, money, influence. Now everything felt strained, like the entire atmosphere had cracked open beneath the weight of what people just witnessed. Charles stood near the center of the stage while conversations slowly restarted around the ballroom in quiet fragments. Not normal conversations, careful ones, measured ones. People weren't discussing charity anymore. They were discussing him. Viola noticed it immediately. The whispers had changed. Earlier, they carried curiosity, shock, entertainment. Now, they carried judgment. That difference mattered. Across the ballroom, two investors Charles spent nearly 6 months negotiating with quietly stepped away from their table while speaking under their breath. One briefly glanced toward the stage before shaking his head slightly. Charles saw it too. His stomach tightened. Because reputation inside wealthy circles worked differently than ordinary life. People tolerated cheating privately all the time. But public cruelty, public humiliation, that made people nervous, especially businessmen protecting their own image. Charles suddenly became aware of every phone still pointed toward the stage. Recording, capturing, saving. The realization hit him harder now. This wasn't staying inside the ballroom. By morning, Miami's social circles would already be talking. Business groups, private chats, investor dinners. His humiliation plan had turned into public self-destruction. Denise stepped beside Viola protectively, while Miss Evelyn remained close nearby, holding her cane carefully. "You ready to leave?" Denise asked quietly. Viola looked toward Charles first, and what she saw surprised her. Fear, real fear. Not just emotional fear, professional fear, social fear. For the first time all night, Charles looked like a man realizing consequences could outlive the moment itself. Near the back of the ballroom, Isabella grabbed a champagne glass from a passing tray with visibly shaking fingers. Interesting, because now the attention she once enjoyed looked unbearable. Earlier she stood proudly beside Charles beneath the stage lights. Now she couldn't even hold eye contact with nearby guests. A woman near one of the investor tables whispered something quietly to her husband while glancing toward Isabella. The husband responded with a look that carried obvious disapproval. Isabella noticed, and her expression tightened instantly. Reality had arrived. Affairs sounded exciting privately. Public shame felt very different. Charles stepped off the stage slowly, while adjusting his tuxedo jacket again out of nervous habit. He immediately approached one of the investors near the front tables. "Frank, listen." The man raised one hand slightly. "Tonight probably isn't the best time." Short response. Professional. Cold. Charles forced a quick laugh. "This situation is being exaggerated." The investor looked toward Viola briefly, then back at Charles. "No," he answered quietly. "It really isn't." That hit harder than Charles expected, because there was no emotion attached to it. Just judgment. The investor walked away calmly afterward, without another word. Charles stood frozen. Viola watched the exchange carefully from across the ballroom, and suddenly she understood something important. For years, Charles believed money protected people from consequences. Tonight proved otherwise. You could buy influence, buy luxury, buy public attention, but character eventually revealed itself under pressure. And once people saw it clearly, no amount of charm fully repaired the damage. Across the room, Isabella finally approached Charles quietly. "We should probably go," she whispered. Charles turned toward her immediately, and for the first time all night, irritation flashed across his face when looking at her. Viola noticed instantly. Interesting, because now that everything collapsed publicly, Charles suddenly looked less fascinated with Isabella too. The fantasy was dying quickly beneath real consequences. Charles lowered his voice sharply. "You think leaving fixes this?" Isabella blinked at him. "I'm trying to help." "No," Charles muttered bitterly. "You're trying to disappear." That line landed harder than he intended. Isabella's face changed immediately. Hurt, embarrassment, defensiveness. Viola watched silently while something sad settled inside her chest. Not jealousy, recognition. Relationships built on secrecy often collapsed once real pressure entered them, because fantasy rarely survives reality intact. Isabella folded her arms tightly. "You're blaming me now?" Charles rubbed both hands across his face. "I'm not doing this right now." "You already did this," Isabella snapped quietly. Several nearby guests pretended not to listen while clearly listening. Charles exhaled harshly. The polished businessman mask he wore all night had started slipping badly now. Every emotion showed too easily. Panic, anger, shame, fear. Miss Evelyn looked toward Viola carefully. "You see him now?" Viola nodded slowly. Yes. She did, not the man she remembered years ago, the man standing here tonight. And somehow seeing him clearly hurt less than constantly hoping he would change. Near the stage, event staff awkwardly avoided eye contact while quietly discussing whether the gala should continue. Even the jazz musicians looked uncomfortable sitting motionless near the back wall. The entire event had become emotionally contaminated by Charles's choices. Denise leaned closer toward Viola. He thought people were going to clap for him. That almost made Viola laugh through lingering tears. Because Denise was right. Charles truly expected admiration tonight. Praise for his honesty. Validation for choosing happiness. Sympathy for leaving an unhappy marriage. Instead, people looked disgusted. Not because he fell in love with someone else, because he turned humiliation into spectacle. Charles suddenly looked toward Viola again, and the second their eyes met, his composure weakened visibly, because Viola no longer looked emotionally shattered. She looked steady, tired, heartbroken, but steady, and that terrified him more than public judgment, because now he understood something devastating. Viola would survive this without him. Meanwhile, his own world was beginning to collapse publicly in ways he never anticipated. Another investor approached Charles slowly near the stage. Charles straightened immediately. Hope flickered briefly across his face, but the older man simply handed him a business card quietly. "For the crisis management firm I use." Charles stared at the card silently. The investor lowered his voice. "You're gonna need them." Then walked away. That moment finally broke something inside Charles emotionally. Viola saw it happen. His shoulders dropped slightly. His confidence weakened again. His breathing changed. Because suddenly, this wasn't just about marriage anymore. His image was damaged, his reputation unstable, his carefully controlled world slipping publicly beyond repair. And for the first time all night, nobody looked impressed by Charles Whitmore anymore. They looked disappointed, which was worse, far worse. Because disappointment couldn't be charmed away easily. Viola slowly wiped beneath one eye, while Miss Evelyn squeezed her hand gently beside her. Then Viola looked around the ballroom one final time. The chandeliers still sparkled, champagne still flowed, luxury still surrounded the room, but now she understood something clearly. None of it mattered. Not the money, not the status, not the appearances, because beneath all the expensive perfection, Charles Whitmore had never been more alone in his life. The ballroom had started breaking into smaller conversations again, but the energy never recovered. Too much damage sat in the air now. People spoke quietly while avoiding direct eye contact with Charles whenever possible. Some guests began leaving early, despite the expensive event still technically continuing around them. The celebration was over. Only the embarrassment remained. Viola stood beside Miss Evelyn and Denise near the front of the ballroom, while staff awkwardly cleared untouched dinner plates from nearby tables. Her emotional exhaustion had settled deep into her body now. Not dramatic exhaustion, heavy exhaustion, the kind that arrived after carrying disappointment for too long. Charles kept watching her from across the room, and every second that passed without her looking back increased the panic growing inside him, because suddenly he understood something terrifying. Viola wasn't waiting for him anymore. For years, even during arguments, there was always emotional connection between them. Anger, pain, hope, something. Tonight, that connection felt thinner, fragile, like she was already halfway gone emotionally. Charles looked toward Isabella briefly. She stood near the ballroom exit, scrolling anxiously through her phone while avoiding attention completely now. No warmth existed between them anymore. No excitement. Only tension. That realization hollowed him out further, because the fantasy collapsed faster than he expected. Once reality entered the room publicly, Charles finally moved toward Viola carefully. Not confidently this time. Cautiously, like a man approaching something already broken. Denise immediately stepped slightly forward. "Oh no." Viola touched her cousin's arm gently. "It's okay." Charles stopped a few feet away from them. For a moment he said nothing, and oddly enough, that silence felt more honest than most of the words he spoke tonight. Miss Evelyn studied him carefully before stepping aside with Denise quietly. Not far, just enough space for the conversation. Charles looked at Viola beneath the soft ballroom lights. Up close, he noticed details he ignored for months. The tiredness beneath her eyes, the tension around her mouth, the emotional exhaustion she carried quietly while still trying to love him. Guilt hit him harder. "You look at me different now," he said softly. Viola answered honestly, "Because I see you different now." That hurt immediately. Charles lowered his eyes briefly before speaking again. "I messed up." Viola almost smiled sadly, hearing how small those words sounded compared to the damage surrounding them. "Messed up?" Charles rubbed one hand over his mouth slowly. "I know that's not enough." "No, it wasn't." The ballroom noise faded softly into the background while Viola studied the man standing in front of her. This was Charles Whitmore stripped of performance. No audience control, no charm, no confidence, just regret arriving too late. Charles inhaled carefully. "I didn't think tonight would turn into this." Viola's expression hardened slightly. "What exactly did you think would happen?" He opened his mouth, then stopped, because for the first time all night, he forced himself to answer honestly internally. He thought Viola would quietly absorb the humiliation, cry privately, disappear gracefully. He never expected her strength publicly. Charles shook his head slowly. "I don't know." That honesty sounded more real than anything else he said tonight. Viola looked down briefly before speaking softly. "You wanted me embarrassed." Charles immediately looked up. "No." "Yes." Her voice stayed calm. "You wanted control over how this ended." Silence. "You wanted the audience seeing you move on first." A pause. "You wanted me too hurt to challenge it." Charles looked devastated hearing it spoken aloud, because deep down, he knew parts of it were true. Viola sighed quietly. "That's what hurts most." Charles stepped slightly closer instinctively. "Viola, please." She looked at him carefully, and suddenly, something inside her softened painfully. Not enough to stay, just enough to grieve. Because standing here now, she could still see traces of the man she once loved hidden underneath all the damage. That was the tragedy. People rarely stop loving all at once. Love fades in pieces, while disappointment grows. Viola's eyes watered slightly again. "You know what's embarrassing?" Charles stayed silent. "I probably still would have forgiven you, That sentence destroyed him emotionally, completely. Charles's face collapsed under the weight of it instantly. Because he believed her, she truly would have. Not because she lacked dignity, because she loved deeply. Viola laughed softly through tears. That's the crazy part. She wiped beneath one eye carefully. You could have sat me down privately. A pause. You could have told the truth. Another pause. You could have given me honesty without humiliation. Charles looked like he could barely breathe now, but instead, her voice weakened slightly. You wanted spectacle. The ballroom around them blurred emotionally for Charles, because suddenly he understood the full ugliness of what he did. Not just cheating, cruelty, intentional cruelty. Charles shook his head slowly. I hate myself right now. Viola looked at him carefully, and strangely enough, she believed that too. But regret after destruction still left destruction behind. Charles's voice lowered almost to a whisper. We can still fix this. There it was. The final attempt, not manipulation this time. Desperation, real desperation. Viola closed her eyes briefly, because part of her once dreamed of hearing those words sincerely. Months ago, she would have grabbed onto them immediately. But tonight, something fundamental changed. Not love completely, trust, and without trust, love eventually suffocated under fear and disappointment. Viola opened her eyes again. There's nothing left to fix, Charles. His face tightened painfully. Don't say that. I have to. Charles looked toward the floor briefly before asking the question quietly. So, that's it? Viola stared at him for several long seconds, then nodded once, slowly, painfully. Yes, the word nearly shattered him, because for the first time in their entire relationship, Viola sounded emotionally certain about leaving him behind. No hesitation, no bargaining, no emotional reaching, just exhausted clarity. Charles's eyes filled slightly despite his effort to stay composed, and seeing him cry should have satisfied her. Instead, it only made everything sadder. Viola stepped back slowly. Not angrily, gently, like someone finally putting down something too heavy to carry anymore. Then she said softly, You spent so much time trying to embarrass me tonight. Charles looked up again. Viola's eyes held sadness now, more than anger. You never realized a good woman leaving quietly is the real loss. Silence. Not dramatic silence. Final silence. Because, deep down, Charles finally understood she was right, and by the time that understanding reached him emotionally, it was already too late. The ballroom doors closed softly behind Viola the second she stepped outside, and for the first time all night, she could breathe. Warm Miami air wrapped around her skin, while distant traffic moved steadily beyond the glowing entrance of Hard Rock Stadium. Valet drivers hurried between luxury cars beneath rows of golden lights, while muffled music still leaked faintly from inside the ballroom behind her. But out here, everything felt quieter, realer. Viola slowly exhaled a breath she felt like she'd been holding for months, maybe years. Denise stepped beside her first. Baby. That one word alone almost made Viola cry again, because Denise's voice carried no judgment, no pity, only love. Miss Evelyn followed carefully behind them with her cane, while the evening breeze moved lightly through her silver curls. You cold? She asked softly. Viola shook her head. No. Truthfully, she barely felt her body at all right now. Emotional exhaustion had settled into her bones too deeply. The bright ballroom lights reflected against the polished black cars waiting outside, while distant city noise hummed across the Miami night. A few guests exiting early glanced toward Viola briefly before quickly looking away again. Not because they looked down on her, because they didn't know what face to make after witnessing something so personal publicly. Denise noticed immediately. Let them stare, she muttered. Viola laughed quietly through lingering tears. Small laugh, tired laugh, but real. And somehow, that mattered. Miss Evelyn reached for her daughter's hand gently. You did good in there. Viola looked at her mother with watery eyes. I don't feel good. Miss Evelyn nodded knowingly. because pain and peace sometimes arrive together. That sentence settled softly inside Viola's chest. For months she imagined this moment differently. If the truth ever fully exploded, if the marriage finally collapsed, if Charles publicly chose someone else, she thought she would completely fall apart. Instead, she felt something stranger, heartbroken, but lighter too. That realization confused her emotionally. Viola looked toward the dark Miami sky, while blinking back more tears. I really loved him. Her voice sounded smaller now outside the ballroom, more vulnerable, because she no longer needed to sound strong for an audience. Miss Evelyn squeezed her hand gently. I know. Denise folded her arms tightly. And he's an idiot. That made Viola laugh again unexpectedly. A fuller laugh this time. Messy, emotional, human. Denise smiled immediately. There she go. Viola wiped beneath her eyes while shaking her head softly. I hate that part of me still feels sad for him. Miss Evelyn answered quietly. That doesn't make you weak. Silence settled around them briefly, while valet attendants moved through the circular driveway nearby. Finally, Viola spoke again. I kept trying to understand how we got here. Denise exhaled sharply. He got selfish. That's how. But Viola shook her head slowly. No. It happened before the cheating. Both women listened carefully. He stopped seeing people emotionally. A pause. Everything became about image. Another pause. Attention. She remembered countless nights sitting beside Charles while he scrolled endlessly through praise from strangers online. Every compliment energized him. Every criticism irritated him disproportionately. Eventually, he started treating admiration like proof of existence. Miss Evelyn nodded sadly. Some people become so hungry for applause, they stop recognizing genuine love. Viola lowered her eyes. That was Charles exactly, and realizing it finally brought strange clarity, because suddenly his behavior stopped feeling random. It wasn't about Isabella specifically. It was about what Isabella represented emotionally. Excitement, validation, admiration, escape from accountability. Meanwhile, Viola represented truth, history, intimacy, reality, and insecure people often ran from the people who knew them too deeply. A black SUV pulled slowly toward the valet area, while soft music drifted faintly through the night air. Viola suddenly realized something shocking. She wasn't embarrassed anymore. Hours ago, humiliation felt unbearable. Now, she mostly felt tired, and, oddly, free. Denise looked toward the ballroom entrance with visible disgust. I still can't believe he really thought humiliating you publicly was going to make him look good. Viola shook her head softly. He thought people would admire honesty. No, Denise corrected immediately. He thought people would admire control. That hit Viola hard, because Denise was right. Tonight was never about truth. Charles wanted power over the ending. Power over perception. Power over her emotions. But somewhere during the confrontation, he lost all of it. Miss Evelyn looked toward her daughter carefully. You know what I'm proud of? Viola blinked slowly. You didn't become cruel. That sentence nearly broke her emotionally again. Because honestly, she had enough pain inside her tonight to destroy Charles publicly if she truly wanted revenge. But deep down, cruelty exhausted her now. She didn't want revenge anymore. She wanted peace. Viola inhaled slowly while warm wind brushed against her dress. Then she admitted something quietly. I thought surviving heartbreak would feel louder. Miss Evelyn smiled faintly. No, baby. A pause. Real healing usually begins very quietly. Viola looked back once toward the ballroom doors glowing behind them. Inside those walls sat her marriage, her humiliation, her memories, and the version of herself that spent too long begging for emotional scraps. But standing outside now, beneath the Miami night, something inside her had already started changing. Not fully healed, not fully whole, but no longer trapped. And for the first time in a very long time, Viola finally felt like her life belonged to her again. Inside the ballroom, the night continued pretending to exist normally. Jazz music had started again near the back wall. Waiters resumed carrying champagne trays between tables. Event staff attempted polite smiles while quietly avoiding the center of the room where everything had collapsed emotionally less than an hour earlier. But nothing actually felt normal anymore, not for Charles. The ballroom that once made him feel important suddenly felt enormous and cold. He stood alone near the edge of the stage, staring at half-empty tables, while conversations lowered every time he walked too close to them. People avoided him now, subtly, professionally, but unmistakably. And Charles noticed every single instance. One investor shook his hand quickly before excusing himself. Another pretended to answer a phone call just to avoid conversation entirely. A wealthy couple who once loved taking photos with him quietly exited through a side doorway without saying goodbye. The shift happened fast, too fast. Charles spent years building influence carefully inside Miami's elite circles. Every gala appearance, every donation, every interview had been part of constructing an image. Successful, controlled, respected. Tonight, that image cracked publicly. And the worst part? He caused it himself. Charles loosened his tie slightly while staring toward the ballroom entrance, where Viola disappeared earlier. The silence she left behind felt heavier than all the public criticism surrounding him, because deep down, he kept replaying one realization over and over. She really meant it. Viola was done, not emotionally wounded and threatening to leave, not angry temporarily, not trying to punish him. Done. Charles sat slowly at one of the nearby tables while untouched champagne glasses reflected softly beneath the chandelier light overhead. For years he always believed reconciliation remained possible eventually, no matter how cold things became between them. Viola still emotionally reached toward him somehow. Tonight, she stopped. And now he understood how dangerous emotional detachment actually was. Not loud anger, quiet acceptance. Across the ballroom, Isabella approached carefully while holding her small clutch purse tightly against her side. Charles looked up immediately. For a brief second, relief crossed his face. Human connection, familiarity, something. But the expression disappeared quickly once he saw her face. She looked overwhelmed, not loving, not supportive, regretful. Isabella stopped several feet from the table. "I think I should go." Charles stared at her silently. That sentence irritated him instantly for reasons he couldn't fully explain. Not because she was wrong, because suddenly he felt abandoned too. The irony almost disgusted him internally. After everything he did to Viola, now he hated feeling emotionally left alone himself. Charles rubbed his forehead slowly. "So that's it?" Isabella shifted uncomfortably. "People are staring at me." Charles almost laughed bitterly hearing that. Now she noticed the judgment. Now public opinion mattered. Isabella lowered her voice. This got out of control. Charles looked up sharply. Out of control? His voice carried frustration now. "You knew what tonight was." Isabella's expression tightened immediately. "No," she answered quietly. "I knew you were ending your marriage publicly." A pause. "I didn't know you were humiliating her." That hit him harder than expected, because hearing it phrased that way stripped away every excuse he built internally. Humiliating her, not moving on, not honesty, not truth. Humiliation. Charles leaned back heavily in his chair. Across the ballroom, several guests glanced toward him before whispering quietly among themselves again. The whispers never stopped now, and for the first time in years, a tension felt awful. Charles used to crave rooms like this, love rooms like this, luxury, influence, recognition. Tonight, every glance felt like judgment instead of admiration. Isabella looked toward the ballroom entrance where Viola exited earlier. She handled that better than I would have. Charles closed his eyes briefly, because that was true too. Viola could have destroyed him publicly if she truly wanted revenge. Instead, she spoke with dignity. That somehow made his behavior look even uglier by comparison. Isabella inhaled carefully. "I should have known something was wrong when you kept talking about control." Charles frowned slightly. "What?" She looked at him directly now. "You kept saying you wanted tonight handled your way." A pause. "You wanted the narrative." Another pause. "You wanted everybody understanding why you moved on." Charles looked away immediately, because hearing his own behavior described objectively sounded worse than he realized. Isabella's voice softened slightly. "I don't think this was ever really about me." That sentence settled heavily between them. Charles didn't answer, because deep down, he feared she might be right. At first, Isabella made him feel exciting again, desired again, admired again. Around her, he escaped responsibility temporarily. No difficult conversations, no emotional history, no accountability, just validation. But validation faded quickly once consequences arrived. Now, sitting inside the damaged remains of his own gala, Charles suddenly felt emotionally empty. The applause he chased for years no longer satisfied him, not after watching Viola walk away, not after seeing disappointment in Miss Evelyn's eyes, not after realizing investors looked embarrassed standing near him publicly. Isabella adjusted her purse strap quietly. "You should probably call Viola tomorrow." Charles laughed once under his breath. Small, broken laugh. She won't answer. The certainty in his voice surprised even him, because, for the first time in their relationship, he truly believed Viola might never emotionally come back. That realization hollowed him out completely. Isabella stayed silent for several long seconds before speaking again. "You loved her." Charles looked toward the ballroom floor, then finally answered honestly, "I think I stopped knowing how." The confession came quietly, not dramatic, just tired truth. Isabella's expression softened slightly, but not romantically, sadly, because now she saw him clearly too. Not powerful, not confident, lost. Charles leaned forward slowly, while rubbing both hands across his face. He remembered Viola years earlier inside their tiny apartment laughing at his terrible cooking attempts. Remembered her staying awake, helping him rehearse presentations. Remembered her defending him when nobody else believed in his business dreams. Yet, and somehow, he traded all of that for applause from strangers who would forget his name eventually. The realization made him feel sick. Across the ballroom, event staff quietly began removing centerpieces from empty tables while guests continued leaving earlier than planned. The gala was ending badly, just like his marriage. Charles suddenly noticed something else terrifying. Nobody was standing beside him anymore. Not truly. Isabella remained physically nearby, but emotionally, distance already existed. And Viola. Viola had finally stopped carrying him emotionally altogether. Charles sat alone beneath the bright ballroom lights, while luxury surrounded him from every direction. Expensive watches, designer suits, million-dollar conversations. None of it mattered now, because, for the first time in his adult life, Charles Whitmore understood what emptiness actually felt like. Not financial emptiness, human emptiness. The kind no amount of admiration could fill once real love walked away quietly. And deep down, he knew he deserved every second of it. The drive home felt strangely quiet. Not uncomfortable quiet, drained quiet. Miami's city lights stretched across the windows while Denise drove carefully through the late-night traffic. Music played softly from the radio at almost impossible to hear volume, blending into the distant hum of tires against wet pavement. Miss Evelyn rested quietly in the back seat beside Viola, one hand still wrapped gently around her daughter's fingers like she was afraid to let go completely. Every now and then, Viola glanced out the window watching neon reflections slide across the glass. Restaurants still crowded, people laughing outside rooftop bars, couples walking hand in hand beneath palm trees. The world kept moving normally. That part always surprised people after heartbreak. You expected everything to stop, but traffic lights still changed. Music still played. Strangers still laughed. Meanwhile, your entire emotional world sat in pieces trying to understand what happened. Denise finally broke the silence first. "You hungry?" Viola laughed softly. That question felt so ordinary, it almost hurt. "A little good." Denise nodded firmly. Crying on an empty stomach is dangerous business. Miss Evelyn smiled faintly beside her. "There's my dramatic niece." "I'm serious," Denise defended immediately. "Heartbreak requires carbohydrates." That earned another tired laugh from Viola. and for the first time all night. The laughter didn't feel forced. Small progress. Tiny, fragile, but real. Viola leaned her head back against the seat slowly, while exhaustion settled deeper into her body. Now that the confrontation ended, now that the adrenaline faded, the grief finally had room to breathe fully. Not just grief over Charles, grief over years. The future she imagined, the marriage she protected, the version of herself that kept shrinking emotionally trying to keep somebody else comfortable. That realization hurt most. Not the cheating, the self-abandonment. Miss Evelyn squeezed her hand gently again. You thinking too hard. Viola smiled weakly. You know me too well. That's a mother's job. Silence returned softly afterward, while rain began tapping lightly against the windshield. Viola watched droplets slide across the glass, and suddenly remembered something from years earlier. One rainy night back in their tiny apartment, Charles pulled blankets into the living room because the roof leaked near the bedroom window. They sat on the floor eating microwave popcorn while listening to thunderstorms outside and laughing over terrible reality television shows. Back then, happiness felt simple, real. Viola closed her eyes briefly against the memory, and surprisingly, it no longer destroyed her emotionally. The sadness remained, probably always would. But tonight she finally understood something important. Missing who someone used to be was not the same thing as needing who they became. That realization brought unexpected peace. Denise glanced toward her carefully while stopping at a red light. You okay? Viola thought about the question honestly. No, not completely, but also not broken the way she expected. I think so, she answered quietly, and for once she meant it. Because underneath all the heartbreak, underneath the humiliation, underneath the exhaustion, something else existed now. Relief. No more pretending. No more protecting lies. No more begging for emotional scraps from someone too distracted by validation to value genuine love properly. Miss Evelyn spoke softly from beside her. You know what most people get wrong about pain? Viola looked toward her mother. They think surviving it means becoming hard. A pause. But surviving pain without losing your softness? Miss Evelyn smiled faintly. That's strength. Viola felt tears rise again instantly. Not from devastation this time. Recognition. Because all night she fought desperately not to become cruel. Even after humiliation, even after betrayal, part of her still wanted protecting her own humanity more than destroying Charles publicly. And somehow, that mattered now. The SUV finally pulled into the quiet driveway of Miss Evelyn's house shortly after midnight. The porch light glowed warmly against the darkness, while rain continued falling softly across the neighborhood. Home, real home, not the mansion Charles bought to impress business magazines, not luxury staged for photographs. This house held Sunday dinners, birthday cakes, family prayers, laughter echoing through small rooms, and love without performance. Viola stepped out slowly into the cool night air while Denise grabbed their bags from the trunk. For a moment, nobody moved. They simply stood together beneath the porch light, listening to rain. Then Miss Evelyn looked toward her daughter carefully. You want to know something? Viola nodded softly. One day this night won't hurt the way it hurts now. Viola swallowed hard. It feels impossible. I know. Miss Evelyn reached up, gently touching her daughter's cheek again. But impossible feelings don't last forever. That sentence settled deep inside her chest. Because all night she kept thinking about endings. Marriage ending. Trust ending. A life chapter ending. But standing there beneath the rain, she suddenly realized something else. Endings also create space. Space for peace. Space for self-respect. Space for healing. Viola looked toward the dark sky while breathing slowly. Then she admitted quietly, I thought dignity meant staying. Denise frowned immediately. Absolutely not. Miss Evelyn smiled softly. No, baby. A pause. Sometimes, dignity means leaving before somebody convinces you accepting disrespect is love. That line changed something permanently inside Viola, because for years she confused endurance with loyalty. She thought loving deeply meant tolerating emotional starvation quietly, but real love was never supposed to make somebody disappear inside themselves. Inside the house, the familiar scent of cinnamon candles wrapped softly around them, while Denise headed toward the kitchen searching for leftover pie like heartbreak recovery depended on it personally. Miss Evelyn disappeared briefly down the hallway. Before returning with a folded blanket she draped gently across Viola's shoulders. Such a small act. Yet somehow it made Viola feel cared for in a way she hadn't felt in months. She sat quietly on the living room couch, staring toward the rain outside, while emotions moved through her slowly. Pain, relief, sadness, freedom, all existing together. And for the first time all night, she stopped replaying what Charles did. Instead, she started thinking about herself, who she was before constantly trying to save someone else emotionally, what peace might look like now, what rebuilding herself could become. Healing still felt far away, but possible. That mattered. Denise returned, carrying plates of pie, dramatically. Therapy dessert. Viola laughed again softly. Then, unexpectedly, she cried too, not because she was falling apart, because she was finally safe enough to feel everything honestly. Miss Evelyn sat beside her carefully, and together they stayed there listening to rain while the hardest night of Viola's life slowly turned into the first night of her freedom. Outside, Miami continued glowing through the darkness. Inside, heartbreak still existed, but something stronger existed too, dignity. And in the end, dignity protected Viola far more powerfully than revenge ever could.